When considering the breadth and history of real-time strategy, there are a few games that stand out as true architects of the genre. Games that, while not known at the time, would end up being the progenitors of entire subgenres, franchises, and communities. Ones that pushed the industry forward in terms of design and mechanics, incorporating new technologies and ideas that would become as fundamental to RTS as Call of Duty is to Activision's yearly release schedule. You've got ones like Dune 2, arguably the original real-time strategy game, kickstarting fundamental concepts like in-depth mouse control and real-time resource gathering. There's Age of Empires, which brought people around to the idea of action-focused strategy games in realistic historical settings, and enshrined the age-up mechanic as an RTS staple. And then there's Total Annihilation, that, among other things, brought a focus on then unexplored mechanics like ballistics, 3D terrain, units, and buildings, and a true fog of war. All of which are staples today, both in games that have clear ties to TA and those that are seemingly irrelevant. Compared to its contemporaries in the late 90s, Total Annihilation was a nearly entirely unique experience. Yes, there were other games on the market that had some similarities in some aspects, like Dark Reign in the 3D terrain department, but no individual title could compete in what TA was putting out. The scale, the economy management, the in-depth combat mechanics, it was all wholly distinct from anything on the market. And while that of course helped to make Total Annihilation special, there were numerous factors at play that led it to become one of the most beloved strategy games of the generation, one that is still referenced and imitated to this day. There was the visual style, the unique setting, the distinctive commander, among many others. But perhaps most importantly, and what single thing had the biggest impact on Total Annihilation's success, was the team who made it. The group of individuals whose single goal was to create a fantastic, real-time strategy game that pushed the genre forward, slaving away working 80 to 100-hour weeks in the final months to get it out the door. To create a game that incorporated new technologies and made it so that any game that came up before it seemed antiquated by comparison. And all the while, not even knowing if the game would be a success or not, launching into a stacked market of real-time strategy competition with the likes of Dark Reign, Command & Conquer, Age of Empires, and many, many more. But it paid off, of course, and today, Total Annihilation is looked back on as one of the greatest in RTS history. It had multiple spiritual successes in its wake, ranging from grassroots, open source community projects like 0K and Beyond All Reason, to massive commercial ventures like Supreme Commander and Planetary Annihilation. But none of these projects would have ever had their first line of code written without the efforts of the original creators of TA, a lot of whom of course went on to create those successes. The initial work on Total Annihilation began in 1995 at Cavedog Entertainment as their debut title. Cavedog had been founded earlier that same year by Humongous Entertainment as a way to pursue development of mainstream computer games, as Humongous was already a household name thanks to their kids game catalogue, with series like Putt Putt, Spy Fox, and Freddy Fish, of course. Or, if you're a video game connoisseur like myself, you may remember them from their Junior Field Trip series, where Buzzy the Knowledge Bug took you through iconic locations like Farm, Jungle, and who could forget, Airport. By coincidence, the same year that Cavedog was founded, Squaresoft shut down their office in Washington, and Cavedog were able to hire many of their former staff. Most notably, composer Jeremy Soule and designer Clayton Kozluric, the latter of whom had already been working on how to incorporate 3D assets into RTS games. It worked out well then that Chris Taylor, Cavedog's first hire, was working on an RTS game engine with 3D height maps, just down the road from Square's now former offices.
The specifics of the game were, of course, design, but the game inspiration came from, you guessed it, Command & Conquer. I played that. I'd waited for that after Dune 2. I felt that the game itself was, Command & Conquer was awesome in every respect, but there were things I wanted, you know? And the classic example was if I was in combat and I decided to retreat, all those big tanks would stop fighting, turn their barrels or like rotate around in the direction and then leave the battlefield. And what you really want to do is you want to keep firing as you're retreating. So you wanted that simulation. So I have this, one of the things I have as a design sensibility is realism, but you cannot let realism destroy a game's design, which is actually easier to do than you think. You know, vehicles could have fuel. Vehicles could have, you know, you could disable a vehicle with taking out a track, a tank. Well, that's no fun. None of that's fun. So, you know, you have to stay focused on the fun factor. Now, the early days, the first 3 months was me working all by myself, right? And then we brought the team on slowly but surely. Clayton Kozlarek, who was the very first person, he was the artist who came in and was going to help create that vision for the look of the game, the style of the game. And it just so happened that we brought some folks in from Square. And Square Enix is kind of famous for starting studios and then shutting them down. So they happen to have that studio and then shut it down. So I think Clayton worked there, and then he knew folks there like Jeremy Soule and Jeff Petkow. So that's how we picked up a lot of those Square folks, because they had just had a studio shut down. So, of course, the market, if you want to call it that, was sort of saturated.
After Total Annihilation's release, Chris would strike out from Cavedog to form a new studio. His own studio. Gas-powered games would go on to be quite the success, at least for a while. Its first game was Dungeon Siege, an action role-playing game in the same vein as Diablo that garnered significant acclaim for GPG. They would use their success to flesh out their newly established franchise with sequels and expansions until 2007, where Chris unveiled his next contribution to strategy, with a game that arguably became even more beloved than his first outing. That game was of course Supreme Commander, and it proved to be a massive hit. But unfortunately, the future wasn't so bright for gas-powered games. While they found success with an expansion to Supreme Commander, their next titles weren't nearly as fortunate. After Demigod, Age of Empires Online, and Space Siege, plus a maligned sequel to Supreme Commander, the company was brought out following severe financial turmoil, and just a few years later, was closed down by their new owner. Chris left the studio voluntarily in the turmoil, and once again the community was entrusted to keep his vision alive, in this case with Supreme Commander and Forged Alliance Forever. Because at the same time that gas-powered games was operating and Supreme Commander was going big, the Total Annihilation community had also been keeping that game alive. Since Cavedog closed down in the early 2000s, fans of TA would keep the spirit of the game alive through a myriad of different avenues. Whether that was recreating the original game in a new engine, developing spiritual successors, or companies featuring original staff funding and releasing entirely new games based on the legacy of Total Annihilation. And while those in the latter camp haven't exactly been the most beloved games ever made, you've got to respect the work put into them. The same can be said for the fan projects, and it's those that actually shine the brightest, more than their corporate counterparts. There's projects like 0K, which has itself been around for a long time and is still being supported, as well as newer endeavours like Bar, Beyond All Reason, which is my personal favourite of all the games to stem from Total Annihilation, and one that I will continue to champion until it gets the recognition it deserves. Though I'll admit it is doing pretty well for itself. It's no stretch to say then that Total Annihilation is one of the most influential strategy games of all time. It helped to lay the groundwork of years and decades worth of RTS to come. And it's no surprise that to this day, people still play it, they still talk about it, and they continue to develop on its success and its legacy. This is Total Annihilation, nearly 30 years later.
Released in September of 1997, the development of Total Annihilation is a curious little combination of having been created at the right time, in the right place, with the right idea, people, and execution. With the likes of Dune 2, Warcraft Orcs and Humans, The Settlers, and of course Command & Conquer having been released in the years leading up to 97, the 90s is widely regarded as the defining era of real-time strategy games, with the early to mid-2000s continuing the genre's momentum to massive commercial success. Age of Empires 2, Command & Conquer Red Alert 2, Empire Earth, Black and White, Homeworld, Myth, Star Wars, Galactic Battlegrounds, and Empire at War, and the Lord of the Rings Battle for Middle-earth series. If there ever was a time to be an RTS fan, this 15-year window of gaming history was easily the best era in which to be one. There was something downright magical about the symbiotic fuse of 90s game design with the rapidly advancing graphical fidelity of modern hardware at the time that proved absolutely essential to the RTS genre. And it's right smack bang in the middle of this particular period of gaming history that Total Annihilation was released. The perfect idea, released at the perfect time, with near perfect execution. In a 2018 interview with PC Gamer, lead designer Chris Taylor stated the following: "It evolved from a bunch of experiences that I had while developing games for most of my childhood, but there was a moment while I was playing the original Command & Conquer where I saw many of the ideas coalesce. I don't know how much TA contributed to the genre's success, but I think more specifically it helped advance the idea that an RTS could be over the top and insane and have more advanced control schemes. This is something I'm still passionate about today." And yeah, this is something that Total Annihilation absolutely contributed to, with the backbone of early pioneers within the genre having provided the baseline to spring from. Taylor's approach to Total Annihilation's gameplay ultimately roots in combining proven gameplay concepts with some key new ideas. But there was one definitive factor that appeared to be missing from the vast majority of real-time strategy games, something that arguably makes a lot of sense: a commander. I always believed that RTS was a true strategy game, and having played a bunch of chess, I felt there was a place to insert some of that. But besides needing a king on the board for the enemy to focus on, the player needed an avatar, a place to feel like they are connected to the game experience. While the likes of Command & Conquer would often refer to the player as Commander, Taylor's interest in this particular concept would soon result in one of Total Annihilation's most defining aspects: a player-controlled commander that would prove absolutely essential to its overall experience. In providing the player with an avatar in which the vast majority of its gameplay could be explored, Chris's aim was to personify what many a previous RTS had only met halfway. Sure, you'd still find yourself developing a fondness for certain units while supervising from above, but in standing side by side with your units and even engaging in direct combat with the enemy, every encounter was one that the player was forced to deal with, and could even be killed off while in the process of doing so, resulting in an immediate game over. Unless, of course, you've adjusted the game's settings to allow the game to continue. I am invincible! The same could be said for when targeting the enemy commander. If you can secure a decent attack on an enemy base, or are perhaps scouting an unknown location and happen to notice their commander skulking around completely unguarded, your immediate instinct is to go for it with everything you've got. The knowledge that one strong wave of enemies could be enough to finish the game before the enemy can sufficiently defend itself instantly heightens the tension of the moment. It's exhilarating when a particularly troublesome enemy is instantly wiped out upon the decimation of their commanding unit. But there's always this little voice in the back of your mind wondering if your own commander is still safe and sound.
Yeah, this whole thing about the chess, I like chess. I think chess just hurts my brain, but I appreciated the game very much so. And what I was doing was, when I was writing the original design, which was called Really Cool War Game, for those of you who don't know that, RCW, the idea was I wanted the player to be more invested, like chess. It was like chess was the example I grabbed. I said, you gotta be more invested in what's going on down on the battlefield. Otherwise, you're just up here and you're just disconnected from the experience. So if I can put you as an avatar down on the battlefield, it will change the emotional connection that you have with the game. And I think that worked. The commander was a way to emotionally get the player invested in what's going on down at the battlefield and bring a little differentiation. Remember, as a designer back then, back in the 90s, you were never trying to duplicate what someone else had done. You're always looking for something to create. Hey, this is fresh, this is new, this is original, and I was all over that. I wanted to produce something that was going to be really, really unique. And that's where a lot of that inspiration came from.
With this in mind, it's appropriate that the designer would compare the game's mechanic to a chess king, because in the world of Total Annihilation, losing the commander was a devastating blow to the player's chances of victory. It makes the game more personal. So if you follow the design logic and say that if commander dies the game is over, then the commander needs to be powerful. And powerful was an understatement. This specific element to the game's design was significant on multiple levels, to offer the player a moving, functional, battle-hardened unit that would play such a key part in every encounter. As opposed to the typical setup of base building via a click of your mouse, the player now found themselves personified, fighting alongside the disposable grunts and vehicles, and fully at risk of being killed off in the same manner that a chess king might be. However, it's also curious that a mech-focused RTS game so far removed from controlling human characters would also ultimately provide the player with a unit in which they could connect to on such a tangible level. Your units might not talk, but you care about them, because you care about your commander. From the moment you load into the game, the commander is you, and it's this component of Total Annihilation that would snowball into every facet of the game, making each and every fight a personal one. Alongside this, the development team's efforts in creating unit and structural designs that both functionally operated within the still rudimentary 3D technology at the time, and yet could also be comfortably associated with the style and aesthetics of their assigned faction, establishes a distinctively recognizable visual style throughout the game.
Yeah, so this question is a good one. And just for the record, I don't think anyone has ever asked me this before. Like, why did we design the units the way we did? Why do they have the particular art style? So I think a lot of the credit just lays right on the shoulders of the artists who designed them, because the instructions to them were make cool things and don't use a lot of polygons. Okay, so you have very little, do something cool. Oh, and then by the way, make them consistent with themselves, right? And I think there were only a few cases where something drifted outside of sort of an art style. But remember, we did this game in 20 months, and it was hair on fire, and a lot of this team came on well into a year. So they only had 8-10 months to build out all these units, and we had a huge tech tree. Like, this was like, we cut the number of factions from typically 3 to 2, which I felt was the best compromise we could make, but we wanted unique units on both sides. So of course the arm was from the outer arm of the galaxy, which meant it kind of inspired from Asimov's Foundation. I don't know if anyone I've ever talked about that. I might have. And then the core, which, you know, when you're all the way on Core Prime, God, I hope that's right, isn't it? Core Prime. You are on Earth. Yeah, you're on Earth. See, remember, I got a lot of stuff in my head, right? And Earth is being completely, like, paved over with metal. Like, we took it all the way. You talk about global warming? Oh, we did better than global warming in this fictional future, right? It's just solid metal. And you can just mine it right off the planet. Anyway, the point is that these guys really did a miracle. And then you add in the things like the ships that are sort of partially underwater, and you have this rendering treatment with Z buffers, and you've got things that can come up out of the water, and all of that technology was amazing. But you couldn't really do it if you had a high poly count. You had to keep the poly count low, hence you had the highly faceted, and arguably substandard, I felt it was sort of like, it's not as good as Command & Conquer, but the benefits of seeing it move over the terrain and banking and moving was like, you lose some, you gain some, and I think we gained more.
Even with the color palette changed, you still associate certain aspects of the unit or structural modeling with their faction. The sleek, more angular core, with their emphasis on clean structure design, which often incorporates a heavy focus on symmetry, as opposed to the ARM forces, which instead come across as more reserved, budget-friendly creations, placing a larger emphasis on functionality, rather than on the core's principle of being deliberately designed in such a manner that comes across as a calculated, mathematically determined effort to appear visually impressive. It's very Rebel Alliance versus the Empire in the sense that the ARM, a faction who also happens to be waging war for the freedom of the universe, is only managing to do so with weapons and equipment that appears to have been desperately cobbled together. The core secondary turrets appear to have been mass-produced from a neat and tidy conveyor belt, having already been redesigned over and over again to the point of being menacingly perfect, whereas the ARM turrets kind of look like they've just been thrown together barely 5 minutes before being chucked into position, more focused on getting the barrels aimed at the direction of the enemy, rather than on how they look. And that's not a criticism. It's visual DNA such as this and the focus on making the player an active participant in the action that gives the player a functional starting point in becoming truly invested in Total Annihilation's overall gameplay. And when combined with Taylor's interest in making the experience as over the top as possible, would soon lead to the game that we continue to know and love to this day.
TA's mechanics may seem benign in comparison to the adrenaline-fueled dopamine assaults of the games of today, but back in the 90s, it was goddamn revolutionary. So much so that many things that were first developed here made their way into other strategy games throughout the years, and have become staples in the RTS landscape. The loop of building your fledgling economy from nothing, managing your metal and energy output and generation to efficiently build up and out, while maintaining your fierce fighting force of robots to a scale magnitudes bigger from where you started, was addictive. And there were always different ways to go about your expansion, as well as tons of unique units and buildings to employ in your arsenal. Of course, not everything TA did had flow-on effects to the rest of the strategy genre, but even the ones that didn't have proved to be fundamental to the game's successes and spiritual sequels that came down the line. Perhaps the most iconic was its unique resource streaming system, something that's become synonymous with Total Annihilation and Supreme Commander likes to this day. While resource mechanics in the 90s were nowhere near as established as they are nowadays, where games usually choose between either picking up and dropping off resources, or simply have them appear on your stockpiles as villagers toil away, there were still the common ways of doing things back in the day, mostly thanks to Command & Conquer, where the system of grabbing lots of one resource, then periodically filling up your storage, was frequently seen. Age of Empires would of course leave its mark as well, with smaller amounts of varied resources coming in frequently as your villagers dropped them off. But TA did something completely different. It instead utilised a streaming system, and it's this system that has persisted basically as is to games like Supreme Commander, Planetary Annihilation, and Beyond All Reason. It introduced a whole new way of thinking about resources. Suddenly it wasn't really about how much of one resource you had, but it was about how quickly you could produce it, and how reliable your production was. This system of having resources constantly flowing in at a set rate meant you could start production of anything you wanted at any time. The game wouldn't hold your hand and say, no, you can't build that. It would simply just let you go for it, and let you learn from your inevitable mistakes. Because building too many things at once meant stalling out your economy, a critical mistake in developing your base. I mean, just think about it. If you're trying to draw, say 20 metal per second, but you're only creating 5, things are going to slow down to a crawl while your economy tries to allocate resources fairly. There were ways to manage this that gave you more wiggle room though. You could build more metal and energy storage to stockpile some of those unused gains, and if you allocated the right number of constructors and buildings to your tasks, you could essentially aim to equalize your production with your streaming rate, making for a perfectly efficient ecosystem with no waste. This was easier said than done though, and effectively managing Total Annihilation's resource mechanics is one of the most challenging hurdles to becoming a good player, especially if you're new. But it was very rewarding, and when you had the perfect dance of resources coming in and resource going out in perfect equilibrium, it was a great feeling. One of the easiest ways to stall out your economy was by assigning too many constructors to do too many things. So it was a balancing act of prioritizing the tasks that needed doing, but not overtasking them to the point where they're actually a detriment to your continued success. But nothing would even get started without your commander. A total do-it-all, the commander was your way to kickstart your economy and, in a pinch, provide an early game defensive weapon against rushing opponents. Or be the one doing the rushing. And while it was outmatched by higher tier units in combat, the commander was the best constructor in terms of build rates by far, surpassing even the later tech dedicated builders. They were a necessity though, as despite being the most capable, the commander could never start building anything higher than the standard Tech 1 buildings. Speaking of techs, Total Annihilation's tech tree was vast, including 4 segments of units and buildings, ranging from what you could build initially to what required either standard or advanced construction vehicles, or production buildings to fabricate. Unlike a lot of RTSs, it meant that advancing tech levels in TA was purely reliant on the physical fabricators that built higher tier units, and buildings being alive, which gave the unique opportunity of being able to knock down your opponent's available assets by specifically targeting their high-end production buildings or constructors. There were no permanent research or unlocks here, everything was temporary, and it helped to make the gameplay very interesting and very volatile, because it made certain units and buildings exceptionally valuable throughout the course of a game. Expensive metal extractors and power generators, for example, became huge high-value targets, perhaps even more so than an advanced fabrication building or a special unit, because that streaming economy meant that unless your opponent had a ton of resources built up, production of everything would slow to a snail's pace if you lost your extractors, regardless of how many fancy production buildings you've got. Thankfully, TA gave an impressively vast array of units to help you deal with any threat that faced you. Broken into 3 tech levels and even more types, the selection is impressive even today. You've got your expected variety of tanks and aircraft, but then there's also bots, seaplanes, warships, submarines, and hovercraft. I love engaging with TA's units because everything is mechanically driven. I don't mean like physically mechanically with an engine and wheels or whatever, I mean gameplay wise. Because of how all the game's systems interact, you can pull off tactical coups that would simply not be possible in other RTSs because of how their mechanics interact. In TA, for example, if I have a unit that moves faster than the turret turn rate of a larger enemy, I can literally just run circles around it and whittle it down for a victory, instead of just instantly losing because this enemy does more damage and it has more health. I can send forward a fast scout to give line of sight to units that I want to keep in the rear guard and not be on the front lines. And I can utilize terrain to engage enemies on my terms by blocking ballistic paths or gaining a height advantage. The way units interact with their surroundings is still impressive to this day, as is the ballistic system, which for me, I think was the most mind-blowing thing about Total Annihilation. The fact that all the tank shells, gunfire, and artillery shots are actual physical objects, and not just hit-scanned lines of code obfuscated by a visual overlay, make it an absolute treat to play and witness. True ballistics, being able to dodge incoming shells, arc fire over terrain, and simply engage your brain into thinking how your fights are going to play out. Man, what a game changer that was. Again, with that little unit running around a big one, the fact that you know it physically cannot fire because the turret needs to align with your unit so a physical object can come out of it, and it needs to physically hit your unit, makes so much sense in reality that seeing it appear in a video game, where previously units would engage like this, makes Total Annihilation still, today, one of the most engaging combat experiences out there, only matched by its successors that employ the very system first created nearly 30 years ago. And still, it did more, because Total Annihilation would be nothing without its innovative terrain system. Contrary to popular belief, TA is not actually a full 3D game. It uses 3D models rather than sprites, yes, but the terrain is simply an isometric 2D map like every other RTS of the 90s. To imitate a fully 3D environment, it uses a 3D height map to give terrain and units a Z-axis to utilize. And before we continue, yes, Dark Reign did actually beat TA to the release of the first RTS with 3D terrain, releasing a few months earlier, but they were both developed independently, so I think it's fair to recognise innovation in both cases. Regardless, TA's 3D map helped to evolve its gameplay past its now archaic, by comparison, 2D counterparts.
So when I was starting at Electronic Arts, well, it was actually called Distinctive Software. It became Electronic Arts Canada. I did a game called Hardball 2. Hardball 2 used a physics engine underneath a projected 2D image. So I understood 3D. So all of this was, of course, going around in my head. And I sat down and I said, you know how we're going to get performance out of this and get all that 3D? Is if we pre-render a 2D bitmap that's a projection, and we keep the camera isometric. So the projections are simpler, faster. I knew I needed to have fast 3D math, so I couldn't spend a lot of time there. But man, not having to render the terrain every pixel, every single time, being able to just take it in memory and copy it over to get that terrain was critical to the look. And we had a theory that it would be awesome, but we didn't know for sure. So Clayton prototyped it and he exported the height map from it. And then I ran the tanks over the image, right? This is all illusion, right? That you have a thing being projected onto a screen with a bitmap, and the tank was a little rectangle. You know, it looked like a little box of matches, right? You know, just going over the terrain. We were like, this is it. This is gonna kill. You know, this is gonna, and of course, we believe it did. People still like the Command and Conquer style units where they were modeled with ultra high polygon and then rendered with a bunch of algorithms for perfect lighting and everything else. So we were at the different end of the spectrum. But that height thing, that was right out of, that was out of Hardball 2. Even though Hardball 2's field was flat, it was the idea that you had a bitmap and you had a 3D model underneath. And that was exactly the same thing in Total Annihilation. So sometimes when you go off on, and you have to develop things that don't seem like they're on your path that you want to be on as an individual in life, you'll think, I want to make strategy games, and what's this baseball thing? It actually ended up really coming full circle and being the most valuable thing I could have done.
The first major effect this had on gameplay was its true line of sight. Units couldn't just simply now see in a set vicinity around it at all times, unless you change the setting in the menu. Terrain might block its view, or augment it when standing at a higher position, making unit placement all that more important. It meant you could send forward scouts and have them be the eyes, allowing long-range artillery or ships to rain fire down safely from behind the battle lines. It also meant there could now be certain unit types that excelled on particular types of terrain, giving more distinction than the usual stat modifications that you'd expect. Total Annihilation used its graphical style in more ways than simply looking cool though, but it did do that as well. More than any other game of its era, TA manages to communicate such a wealth of useful information through its visuals that it astounds me looking at it today with hindsight. It's amazing how Cavedog managed to tie together gameplay, user interface, and graphics in a way that is both natural and useful. Think of other big RTSs of the day, Age of Empires, Command & Conquer, or StarCraft, you get the idea. None can hope to match what TA does with visual communication. Take AoE for example, one that all of us are familiar with. There, units don't look any different no matter how damaged they are. The storage pit doesn't fill up the more resources you have. These are not inherently bad things, but it does show you how much TA is able to communicate in comparison thanks to its use of 3D models and effects, where every facet of the game has some level of visual communication. Take the metal extractor, for instance. The spinning crank on the top not only brings life to a pretty boring building, but it also communicates the rate at which metal is being extracted, as the crank moves slower according to the amount of metal you're getting per second. You quickly get used to the regular speed of a max rate metal extractor, and soon you can instantly tell if you're getting a slower rate with just a cursory glance. It also stops entirely if you manually disable the building, Other resource buildings are like this too. The wind generator turns and changes rotation speed depending on the wind strength, and the metal maker drastically changes its appearance depending on whether it's powered on or not. And this extends to units as well, and here it's much more impactful on the moment-to-moment gameplay. Turrets on tanks will turn independently of the chassis they're built on, indicating firing arcs and how long it's going to be till they can actually shoot. And as mentioned, the shells fired are actual objects that come from the end of the turret, giving you information on whether you're landing shots or missing, helping you refine your encounter strategy. Ships in the water have particle effects that indicate speed, turn rate, and angle. Air transports physically show the units they're carrying and are required to change their Z depth to drop them off, rather than have them simply appear on the ground below when you order an unload. All of this affects how you play the game in ways that you probably don't even notice. You'll subconsciously pick up on the fact that you need to give a transport a few seconds to land and drop off a unit. And a tank may have a prescribed fire rate, but it will simply never fire at an enemy running circles around it where it's faster than the speed its turret can turn. Mechanics like these make even the smallest encounter much more engaging than they might seem on the surface, and overall, they sometimes make Total Annihilation feel more like a game of chess, or maybe more accurately as lots of little games of chess, instead of the assumed damage per second slugfest that most RTS games of the era devolve into.
As touched on earlier in the video, much of Total Annihilation's appeal stems from its personal relationship with the player, the means in which it uses the commander unit to personify and thereby involve the player in the action. And while this is true, it's also merely the starting point. With the previous section having focused on the mechanics of Total Annihilation, I'd like to zero in on its overall feeling, the vibe and impressions it makes on the player through its style, visual impact, and sound design. Be it the massive on-screen explosions, the ringing laser fire, or the gorgeous orchestral soundtrack, courtesy of Jeremy Soule, Total Annihilation is a perfect example of successfully combining visual spectacle with effective music and sound design. Most, if not all, of the units seen throughout the game have a distinctively recognizable sound or audio trigger that cements itself firmly in your mind. In a lot of ways, it's how the game makes up for the absence of any unit dialogue. You might not have Tanya laughing menacingly in the distance, but you can be damn sure that the awesome sound of a Sentinel laser tower, the devastatingly recognizable repeating fire of a Brawler squadron, or the immense cannon blast of a Big Bertha destroying multiple units at once while a shower of metal explodes into the air. Yeah, these aren't going to be sounds that you're likely to forget anytime soon. It's to the credit of supervising sound designer Frank Bree that even now, 2 decades later, if I ever hear any of these often rather chipper unit sounds in some obscure place later in creative history, I instantly recognize them for being TA sounds, because a lot of these were created from scratch for the purpose of being used in the game.
So Frank Bree, who's our audio guru, we said, can we just make some sounds of creaking tank movements and this and that, and then we realized it's like, oh my god, this is better because you can do less of them, they can be smaller, they don't take as much engineering time, they don't get monotonous on your ears, they could disappear for a while and you wouldn't even notice them gone. So we did really analyze the voice thing and had to make a very quick decision to just say no. We're not going down that road. It's not going to work.
As a result of this, every unit, be it structure, infantry, aircraft, or vehicle, has a distinctly signature audio snippet upon selection. It's a fantastic means of further embellishing the player's relationship with them. You grow fond of these little guys. You don't necessarily want to send infantry in by the hundreds to destroy your enemies, and every time one of them pops into sweet oblivion when a rogue missile hits them, it does kind of sting a little. You care, even if only remotely, about the fate that befalls your units. But when that moment of victory comes around, it does feel pretty damn good too. Especially when assaults on enemy bases look a lot like this. Combined with the music, which we'll talk about a little bit later, every encounter with enemy forces in this game feels exciting, with your screen being full to the brim with the explosions and pieces of metal flying in all directions. Be it a minor enemy game skirmish, an unsuccessful Air Force run, or a full-blown assault on the enemy base, it always gives the impression of an aggressively brutal encounter, with each side mercilessly hammering the other with everything they've got. Let's take a moment to now compare this to another one of my favorite RTS games of all time, Red Alert 2. Now, I love Red Alert 2, let's just get that fact out of the way, huge fan, okay? And yet, I have to admit, barring the exception of a handful of units, such as your Tesla towers or your Prism tanks and whatnot, the visualization of battles throughout Red Alert 2 is undeniably flat and one note by comparison to the sheer bombastic madness of Total Annihilation. Sure, don't get me wrong, Red Alert 2 is still a wonderfully interesting game visually, especially in regards to its unit and structure design, and its overall gameplay still remains some of the most satisfying real-time strategy experiences ever made. But there's just something about the chaotic masterpieces of explosive insanity witnessed throughout Total Annihilation's 3D battles that lifts it just that fraction higher. From the distinctively colourful laser cannon shots, to smoke trails following the wake of missiles, plumes of shrapnel flying all over the place, to units exploding here, there and everywhere, leaving nothing but a smoking metal husk, TA's gameplay has all the visual bells and whistles of a fireworks display. It's an absolute thrill to take part in these fights, no matter which direction victory ultimately swings. And yet, alongside the explosions, there's another side to Total Annihilation that proves a little surprising for a game so heavily focused on robots beating the metallic stuffing out of each other. The atmosphere. Periodically, you'll often find yourself in something of a lull before the next encounter, a bit of downtime to catch your breath, mop up some metal carcasses, and repair any damage. And it's during these moments that Total Annihilation's atmosphere really shines through, especially when paired with Jeremy Soul's incredible soundtrack. While the massive orchestral tracks are enormously effective in bringing the game's combat to life, such as brutal battle, fire and ice, or attack, it's to the credit of a soundtrack that barely peaks 30 minutes in runtime that it also happens to be so goddamn memorable and effective with its more subtle moments. Most familiar with Soul's work are likely fans of his later career, the Harry Potter or Elder Scrolls games for example. Most will often forget that one of his earliest projects just so happened to be of all things an RTS game about a bunch of robots blowing each other up.
Ron hired Jeremy, and then Jeremy, I believe, you got to give credit where credit is due. Jeremy said, "Why don't I compose an orchestral soundtrack?" And I said, "Oh my God, that'd be amazing because Star Wars, because of every big Hollywood epic has a composed score that has themes and things like that." So Jeremy said, "Oh, this is great," and Ron signed off on that. And it ended up costing, back then, this was cheap, but still big money. It's like a contradiction in terms. $60,000 for the Northwest Sinfonia, otherwise known as the Seattle Symphony Orchestra, to sit, professionals, and to play this music live. You need orchestrators, you need all these things, you need to break, oh my God, it was so epic for such a low budget thing. I don't think any of us could really believe it. But what really blew our minds is how freaking well it was received. Everyone was just like, "Oh, it's amazing." People were just like, "I play it all the time." We had Redbook audio like on the CD, so you could just put it into your CD player. We worked that out. This was all just magic that happened through the collaboration of all the various people and personalities involved in the project, and that's, arguably the root of it all is Jeremy. Jeremy drove with passion. I mean, you guys think excuse me, you think I'm passionate at 57? I mean, at 21, he was just an unstoppable force, convincing us that this is going to be the greatest thing ever, and he's going to compose it. I mean, you could say he is and certainly was a musical genius back then, and we knew it.
Here's a fun experiment. Have you ever played Total Annihilation with the music turned off? If you ever doubted how crucial the soundtrack is to its overall experience, I urge you to give it a try, because this game sounds absolutely barren without its music. Sure, don't get me wrong, TA's gameplay is still a lot of fun with or without the soundtrack, but there's something just so integral to the vibe and atmosphere of Total Annihilation's world that relies so heavily on its music. It's impossible to imagine a version of this game releasing without it. If I'm harvesting metal from the dead husks of my enemies, or commanding K-bots to build structures and I don't hear the eerily mysterious death and decay simmering in the background, this game just feels wrong. The same goes for the ominous passage's futile attempts, stealth, licking wounds, and on throughout the night. Where the magnificent orchestral peaks and surges of Warpath might be effective in elevating the game's combat, the same can also be said for the soundtrack's calmer moments. Saul's compositions are remarkably sobering, but where a track such as Futile Attempt or On Throughout the Night might be the starting point, presenting an atmosphere already full to the brim with lonely introspection in the wake of a recent battle or attack, cautiously awaiting the next wave of enemies to come knocking at your door, well, it's those such as Desolation, Charred Dreams, or Blood of the Machines which become truly beautifully haunting. Okay, now that I've spent some time talking about the overall feeling of the gameplay, I'm going to delve into the campaign for a moment. A particular aspect of this game which I have to admit, up until the preparation to make this video, I've never played.
What?
I realize that sounds really dumb, but hear me out. When I was a kid, I played a lot of Skirmish back in the day. I loved filling a map up with enemies and slowly working my way through them. And if we fast forward to my adult years, each and every time I've booted up this game since my childhood, I always end up playing a lot of Skirmish. I've never felt an incentive to play the campaign because the Skirmish has just been so good. So, if there's any particular section of this game completely removed from my nostalgic goggles, it's going to be the campaign. Which is interesting, because to be completely honest, the campaign isn't nearly as memorable as the Skirmish battles can be. Don't get me wrong, it isn't bad or anything. In fact, I'd argue that it does a pretty good job of strong-arming the player into exploring all facets of its gameplay, not just the infantry or the air force, but also its vehicles and shipyard. If you're a more cautious player by nature, you'll also find yourself occasionally shoved into more precarious situations, which forces you to act more aggressively and more quickly in the face of imminent danger. The story also provides a decent amount of game lore too. Like many a classic RTS, the game relies on introductory "Commander, your mission is" styled cutscenes to establish context and provide some initial tension as the stakes continue to rise higher and higher, from the humble beginnings of just destroy a K-bot lab or capture a specific unit, all the way through to the gradual signs of securing galactic liberation or conquest, depending on your faction. It is curious to see how similar the Armored Core are in their methods, and yet they ultimately aim for two considerably different objectives: a fight for freedom versus a fight for domination, which is about as classic good guy versus bad guy as it gets. But when it comes to the literal gameplay, at the end of the day, the campaign's best moments are their final ones. The last battle before ultimate victory is a legitimately tough game. You're constantly battered by the enemy forces. They come at you in waves upon waves in a manner that is notably far more aggressive by comparison to Skirmish on the hardest difficulty. I was constantly repairing my defensive wall while taking potshots with long-range cannons. As soon as your attention is directed elsewhere, you might suddenly be attacked by a large portion of enemies. It's a fairly intense mission. But to look at the overall campaign, in essence, the basic structure follows the same fundamental bullet points for both factions. Recover from a near-defeat situation, work your way through a series of planets, learning more about the enemy while unlocking various technological trees, and then defeat the enemy in a final battle. The only real difference between the two is the difficulty spike. It's notably far tougher to complete the core final battle as opposed to the ARM. The immediate assortment of infantry and vehicles gives the ARM commander a really strong head start in dealing damage to enemy defenses, and the limitless supply of metal pretty much guarantees the ARM a free pass when it comes to energy management. Whereas the core commander is effectively on the back foot for the entire mission. Which I guess makes sense for it being the bad guy, but it would have been nice to see the ARM Rebellion be faced with a little bit more challenge. I still maintain that of all the campaign missions, it feels like those two missions are the only ones that really get the most out of TA's gameplay loop. Although, I would also be remiss if I didn't admit the fact that with the limitations of the hardware and the resources at the time of its development, I think TA's campaign is likely the best it could be, and the fact that the gameplay is just so much more enjoyable outside of that is to me more of an indication that TA's gameplay is just legitimately fantastic. And the only caveat to that statement is that it becomes less so when restrictions are placed on it, which feels like a very natural thing. If the campaign has taught me anything, it's that TA's gameplay is a whole lot more entertaining when it's offering as much freedom to the player as possible. And that's okay, because if any TA fan had to choose, I'd be willing to bet most would happily just accept the gameplay and unit design for what it is, because we as a player base adore that gameplay loop. And as a result, it again only makes sense that it would be a little less enjoyable when large portions of it are taken away or put behind locked doors. It's the game's tremendous use of explosive RTS battles and its euphoric soundtrack that makes Total Annihilation the game we know and love. And with very good reason. Sadly, even in spite of the success of Total Annihilation, both in terms of commercial and critical acclaim, multiple awards, and a marginally successful spiritual sequel, Cavedog's future was one that wouldn't end happily. Barely a year following the 1990 release of Total Annihilation Kingdoms, a franchise-branded sequel that would instead take place within a medieval fantasy universe, Cavedog declared bankruptcy in the turn of the millennium year 2000, with the mismanagement of parent company GT Interactive often being quoted to be a significant factor in this decision being made. But this wasn't the only piece of bad luck that would impact Cavedog's fate. Kingdoms, while sharing multiple gameplay similarities such as its mechanics, multiple factions, and resource management, didn't resonate with players to nearly the same degree as its predecessor. The general census being that although the game was legitimately beautiful in terms of its visuals and faction design, it was a well-crafted yet largely unremarkable experience, which may have been a symptom of Chris Taylor's departure following the release of Total Annihilation's core contingency expansions. Contrary to popular belief at the time, he wasn't involved in Kingdoms in the slightest, and it would appear that this key input was sorely missed. Which is a bit of a shame, because Taylor's opinion on the project's potential wasn't a bad one at all.
We shipped core contingency, and I left, and I had no idea they were making Kingdoms. So my involvement with Kingdoms was zero, and I'm not saying that to distance myself from it because it didn't do as well as people had hoped. I actually, when I heard about it, it sounded like a great idea, and they explored new ideas. They were exploring concepts that some worked, some didn't. Hats off to them for doing that.
With an expanded factions list from 2 to 4, the inclusion of a quasi-commander unit, the Monarch, which retained the initial early impression of an in-game player substitute being present on the map, and the use of spells which could be used to defend your base or attack the enemy, Kingdoms was clearly made with a fair amount of ambition. a desire to see the franchise expanded upon not just in the linear sense of making more robots kill even more robots, but also in the spiritual sense of retaining recognizable gameplay mechanics and adjusting these where needed to fit a completely different genre. For example, unlike the use of energy and metal seen throughout the original TA, players only required the use of a single resource, mana, which could be harvested by building resource-gathering lodestones in certain locations. Also similar to the original TA, the player can recycle the scattered debris and carcasses of fallen units or structures, as well as harvesting natural objects on the map to obtain additional mana, such as trees or stones. Unfortunately, however, even with it having some legitimately interesting ideas, Kingdoms just didn't succeed where it needed to at the time of its release. The world building and visual design was praised, but the gameplay was found by many to be a tad underwhelming, lacking the fun, bombastic nature of its predecessor, with other technical issues also being reported at initial release, such as poor examples of pathfinding and some heavy in-game lag, which would be patched out at a later date. In short though, it was fine in the eyes of most, and fine just didn't win over enough players to reward the development team with commercial success. Which is a real shame because it's clear from Cavedog's portfolio of cancelled projects that the developer was clearly interested in testing the water of other genres. For instance, a cancelled first-person shooter by the name of Amen the Awakening, Elysium, a cancelled fantasy adventure, and Good and Evil, a cancelled adventure game said to be made in heavy collaboration with none other than Ron Gilbert of The Secret of Monkey Island fame, who also just so happened to be a Cavedog founder, which is the kind of marriage made in heaven that could have resulted in a really interesting final product. Also, a little bit of trivia, Ron Gilbert is apparently the chap who ended up coining the now well-known gaming term cutscene, with it first being used in the point-and-click adventure game Maniac Mansion. The more you know, I guess. But to get back to Cavedog's future, unfortunately it just wasn't meant to be. Senior company and publisher GT Interactive, which was also spiraling further into debt around the same time, was purchased by Infogames, and the Cavedog label became one of many to be promptly discarded, as executive priority leaned towards the more commercially viable sources of revenue, namely children's games. Which is a cruel yet largely unexpected outcome following the release of a spiritual sequel that did what it could to keep the wheels turning, and yet ultimately failed to establish Total Annihilation's brand as a marketable franchise, in the vein of, say, Command & Conquer or Total War. However, if we fast forward by 25 years, there is at least a silver lining in the fact that a recognizably passionate fanbase for Total Annihilation Kingdoms still exists, with fan mods doing their best to smoothen out the technical issues, while also upscaling the game for newer hardware resolutions. It might not have been the game that Cavedog needed in 1999, but there are still fans out there playing Kingdoms to this day, with an overall rating of 4.1 out of 5 on GOG being an easy example of that. Kingdoms, for all its bumps and bruises along the way, eventually found an audience. And sometimes that's just the way things go with media. It might not have been a commercial hit, but even the most unsuccessful projects can find their audience years or even decades down the line. Cavedog's legacy might have been one that ended up being a little bittersweet with how things turned out, but they still gave players experiences that were worth remembering, even 25 years later.
Asking this question, how did you decide to leave Cavedog, is kind of like a who shot Kennedy kind of question, because maybe you know that, because that's why you're asking, because it's a little bit of a politically charged thing. You know, people, let me answer the question like this. People don't leave things where there's a lot of success unless they feel like something wasn't going well. And I told everyone a bit of a lie, but I did it for legal reasons. I did it for personality reasons. That it was still early days. If you think about it, that was almost 30 years ago, right? The reason was obviously because I didn't agree with management, right? I had a direct disagreement with management, and I'm going to just call it that. I also think now that I've had all these years to reflect on why I left, was because I really did want to go start my own company. I didn't want to have to listen to someone else as to, now in the process of leaving, I left a lot of good things behind, right? Ron Gilbert is a really creative, brilliant guy, and a lot of the credit of the success of Total Annihilation on multiple levels is owed to him. And he probably doesn't get a lot of call outs. But just because he's brilliant and just because of all the positives, it doesn't mean that a guy doesn't want to go out on his own. Maybe I'll tell every detail of this story in a memoir or a book or something before I die, so that I don't care. I can just throw it over the fence and fall into a box. But I will I will tell you that when you have a company, and I can probably say this, I'll throw at least one person under the bus, or one entity under the bus, and that is GT Interactive. I believed that GT Interactive was not a terribly good company. In my heart and in my soul, when I went to the store, when I looked at the games they were making, I thought, I do not like this company. I had an opinion. I didn't like the way they operated. I didn't even know all the ways that they operated, but I knew there was something not right about them. Well, of course, when they went in, they bought Humongous Entertainment, and then as a function of that, they owned Cave Dog, and as a function of that, they owned the IP of Total Annihilation. Then a few years later, they're sued by their shareholders because they did a bunch of shenanigans and they made the value of their company not what it was, and they got all this legal hot water with the SEC. I was like, my instincts were correct. They were a bit of a shady company. Now, if somebody from, and I doubt it very much, from GT Interactive is watching this, they would have a hard time disagreeing with me that shady things took place. So I went off on my own, and I was happy to do so, to get that start and to build gas-powered games and do it just like a childhood fantasy.
After leaving Cave Dog, Chris started his own studio in gas-powered games. Here, he and his team would develop Dungeon Siege as their first game, a title that in of itself would prove to be a massive hit, and the start of a beloved series. But it wouldn't be until the mid-2000s that Chris would begin his trip back to the genre that he knew so well.
I really didn't put pen to paper during Dungeon Siege at all. Like, I was so focused on Dungeon Siege, but when Dungeon Siege was finished, I started writing down the ideas that I had in my head, all the things that I wished I had done that took the RTS to the next level. One of those was this larger scope and scale of battle. So once I started thinking about large battle, I have this saying: strategy happens before the battle, tactics happen during. You look at the Normandy invasion or something called Operation Overlord. They planned for months, right? It was all the strategy was in the planning. Oh, we're going to have ships, we're going to have air, we're going to have soldiers, we're going to have paratroopers. That was all strategy. And then the day it happened, when people are running up the beach and they're shooting and all that's going on, it's all tactical, okay? So I was really all about, well, how do you bring strategy for real-time strategy back into the game? And it turns out it's scale. As soon as I got scale, I needed strategic zoom. So strategic zoom just fell right out of it. And I looked around me and I was like, wait a minute, has no one done strategic zoom? And guess what? Not even. There were art programs where you had to do crazy zoom in and then shift, zoom in and then shift. And then it was so clumsy and awkward. I was like, this is the greatest thing ever. How come no one's thought of this? I gotta disambiguate something. What I do is not the same as what the entire team does. I get a vision for something. I create a design for something. The team builds it. I don't build the game, right? The team builds it. And the team takes my core design and makes it really work. I think too many times lead designer guys get too much credit. Without the team, you don't have anything.
While Supreme Commander was a spiritual successor to Total Annihilation, ultimately it was its own game. That's even more obvious nowadays, as the TA vs SC debate rages on, likely to continue until you and I have turned to dust, just as the conflict between Core and ARM continues in TA forever. But at the end of the day, both are fantastic games, and can coexist peacefully, as they have for the last, nearly 2 decades? Supreme Commander's first primary difference came in how it viewed the Commander, both as a tool of your economy and a war machine. The Commander in Subcom is much more versatile than its TA counterpart. It can be upgraded to build higher tier units, be modified to include more powerful weapons and equipment, and drastically improve its capability as a resource generation tool. The other fundamental difference in SOPCOM came in its approach to factions. Eventually including 4 unique options, the factions here were much more fleshed out than the core and ARM in Total Annihilation. Plus, they were more asymmetrical, thanks to their expansive unit trees and game-changing experimental unit rosters. Perhaps the most iconic part of Supreme Commander. SOPCOM did extremely well for itself, and it spawned a series and fanbase arguably even greater than that of Total Annihilation. But I don't need to tell you that, of course. I'm sure you all know about the continued success of Forged Alliance Forever, and the community that surrounds it. People to this day are still playing Supreme Commander all over the world, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. And while it's great that that's the case, the story around what happened with Supreme Commander is kind of tragic. Supreme Commander 2 did at least release, but it was nowhere near what fans of the first game were hoping for. And after its mediocre sales, mediocre critical reception, and very mediocre fan response, it was all downhill for gas-powered games from there. For the record, I think Supreme Commander 2 is a bad sequel, but on its own, it's still a very good game. And were the situation different, there is probably a world out there where Supreme Commander 2 could have thrived, and the future would have looked a whole lot different. But unfortunately, sometimes the realities of the day just set in. And one thing I've picked up on from talking to developers over the years is that for the most part, an unsuccessful game hardly ever comes from a lack of effort or talent. And yet it can be easy to look back and say things could have been different or we should have done this differently. But hindsight's 2020, and the future is anything but.
Supreme Commander 2, was that what we wanted to build? Would we do it again? And the answer is probably not, but you have to have a lot of asterisks, because we often don't want to hear the details. And the details are we had a limited time, we were incredibly crunched for time, and we had a limited budget, and we were sort of in a really tough spot in the economy. And the publisher, whom you know, is wanted a console version. They're a very console-centric publisher, and that console really meant that we couldn't do 2 versions. We couldn't do a full-blown PC version. We needed one code base that would compile and run more or less on both. And the team did an amazing job, absolutely an amazing job. We came up with a bunch of new concepts in design that we tried. The console controller was way better than we thought it was going to be, given the time we had. There was a lot of breakthroughs, but when you develop like that, what you're doing is you've switched from sort of an artistic, kind of modus operandi into a business-driven paradigm of developing software. And guess what? It doesn't really yield the best results. Now, there's ways to screw up the other end of it. Oh, you've got all the money in the world, and you've got all the time in the world. You can fall off the bell curve on both sides, if you will, right? And if you want to be at the top of a bell curve for anything, like the ideal expression of a form of art or a piece of technology or what have you, in your delivery to market and all that, it's hard no matter what. But we were under duress, and that was probably worse than not being under duress. Let me give you an example. Back in 2017, I was talking to some publishers, and one of the publishers offered me a very large sum of money to build a next-gen RTS game. And they didn't offer to me the budget for it, right? Which means I would have been working 12 hours a day. I probably would have been working most days of the week, especially, at the end. There would have been a lot of risk. And no matter how much that seemed like, it was half as much money as was necessary to build a competitive game. And my answer to them, and you know the answer to this question, was no. No, thank you. I kind of now, they say, younger folks, 20-somethings or whatever, don't know what they don't know, so they're foolish enough to take a challenge. Climb that sheer section of cliff. You can do it in your underpants or whatever, right? Just mission impossible. I can do it. But when you get older and you start to realize how hard something is, you're more likely to say no. And that was definitely me in 2017. I was like, no, I'm not going to accept the invitation to go and basically go on a death march to try to build something, because you have to be sure of this one thing. If I was going to build the next RTS game after Supreme Commander 1 and 2, it had better blow your mind, right? It had better be the greatest thing you have ever seen. Otherwise, I'm a failure.
We are all used to seeing a groundswell of community support arise for older games, but Total Annihilation has to be one of the most prominent examples I think I've ever seen. The first indication of a life for TA outside of its prescribed walls came in the form of the Spring engine, first released to the public in 2007. Spring is an open source and completely free game engine developed in the mid-2000s initially as what was basically a Total Annihilation rebuild, known simply as TA Spring. It morphed a hell of a lot since then though, and it's now a full general-purpose RTS game engine, forming the core of many of the Total Annihilation-derived titles that we know and love today. One of those is 0K, one of the first large-scale spiritual successors to TA. It was released on Steam back in 2018, but it was available long before then, being able to be downloaded way back in 2010. 0K has changed quite a bit over the years, and it's still receiving updates despite a fairly small player base. At this point, it's a fully independent game, complete with original community-developed content and its own feature set. And on the complete other spectrum to 0K and Spring, we have Planetary Annihilation, which, if I'm not mistaken, was the first spiritual successor to Total Annihilation to go commercial, i.e. not being available for free, and not just some community hobby project. That's apart from Spring Commander, of course, as well. And not to take anything away from the Spring or 0K developers, but being able to call yourself a real company with a name and a logo and throw a bunch of big names and dollars around definitely gave PA an air of credibility that proved very successful for its creators, as they raised a truckload of money through Kickstarter with grand promises of the next big real-time strategy game. After a modest release, months of updates, and a standalone expansion, PA arrived at a state that most people concluded was, not too bad, even pretty good. Personally myself, I wasn't very fond of it, but I'll leave those opinions for other videos. The latest commercial project from the minds behind Planetary Annihilation is Industrial Annihilation, another publicly funded Kickstarter-like project positioned as a sequel to PA. It's currently in development and has a Steam Early Access scheduled for Q2 of this year, which is right now, actually, so we'll see what happens. I'll keep my words on this one brief, as, well, if you've seen this video, you know I'm not exactly the biggest fan of what they're doing here. This video is meant to be a celebration of TA though, so let's not get too far into the weeds. You can go watch it for yourself if you're interested. Because lastly here we have Beyond All Reason, or BAR for short. And in my opinion, this is the best way to relive what made Total Annihilation special in 2024. As it's essentially just that, Total Annihilation in 2024.
Hi, I'm Harith. I'm the lead developer of BAR.
Hi, I'm Icequick. I'm the lead creative director on BAR.
I personally started work on BAR about 12 years ago in 2011, and we trace its lineage back from the Balanced Annihilation game on the Spring RTS engine. And the reason why I did this is that I wanted something that satisfied all of those needs that we had, while also offering a graphics and user-friendliness package to make this spectacle as pleasing as possible for everyone.
The initial goals when we really started working on the BAR project in 2018 was to get that level, the next level of quality, both in visuals, audio, but obviously also gameplay. Some main goals were that macro balance in terms of strategy gameplay. We thought it wasn't really good, but we tried to perfect that even further. The support for really massive epic battles with more than just 250 units with an exponentially scaling economy. Also the interface, which already had like really great usability stuff in there, but increasing that to sometimes say we think we have the most powerful user interface in maybe any strategy game. Also, the freedom in terms of possible strategies is something that we really love from TA as well, obviously because of the large unit roster, but we expanded that as well. So a goal there was to expand that further without, of course, adding units that were redundant or not used. And then maybe the biggest, most important one is to keep it fun. I mean, it's a game after all, and it's meant to be fun. So you can think of many things to expand or goals to achieve for, but fun is a major one in that. The main goal that was like when we started was we have like a rough diamond here. It's so great, and we just want as much people to be able to play that. And yes, then we need to fix stuff, we need to polish stuff, and we need to get it up to that level to where also other people, maybe outside of the already established TA Supreme Commander strategy genre, would be interested as well. Because we think it's just too fun and too great to keep to ourselves.
Like 0K, Bar is a free, open source, community-led project, and it's been in a playable state for quite a while now, despite its alpha development label. Unfortunately, it's not on Steam just yet, but downloading it via their website and using their launcher is very, very simple. There's no excuse to not give it a try if you're a fan of Total Annihilation. Like TA, it features 2 factions, Vortex and Armada, very cute, and a whole host of units and buildings spread across a tech stack that is quite familiar. In fact, there's a lot about Bar that is indeed quite familiar, by design, of course. On the technical front, Bar is also very impressive, improving on TA in many ways. Obviously the graphics are a standout, but just the pure amount of stuff that can be put on screen at any one time is insane. I mean, look at this recent monstrosity, a 2-team 30v30 player slugfest that is somehow running, like, at all, and also kinda smoothly, at least until the end. And obviously, yeah, this is an extreme, but even just playing with a couple of friends, Bar is easy to download, it's even easier to get online, and it looks great and it runs perfectly. So yeah, while we will almost certainly never get a Total Annihilation 2, despite Ron Gilbert saying it was definitely for sure 100% happening back in the late 90s, Bar proves that we probably don't even need one, because it fulfills the role all on its own. And it certainly makes me question why you'd consider putting money down on a no guarantees pre-order or investment scheme for Industrial Annihilation. You can still play the actual Total Annihilation today, of course, and many people do, but if you want modern conveniences, incredible graphics, and updated mechanics and systems, then Beyond All Reason is where you should be looking.
We grew a lot in the last few years, especially with the influx of a lot of new people and contributors helping there. We could increase the scope on many fronts: graphics, music, a lot more dynamic audio systems and audio stuff, a lot of engine upgrades, performance-wise, but also functional-wise, bug fixing, stability. Single player stuff like scenarios and a lot of server tooling to be able to manage the entire community and people playing.
The original goals that we set out to make a very fun, very performant, and very beautiful strategy game that's adored by others, I think we are very close to that goal. With the amount of players that we support inside of a single game being pretty much unprecedented in the RTS genre is amazing to see, and how much fun people are having day to day is also just absolutely stunning. Obviously, with this kind of growth, there was a huge growth as well, a wonderful growth in contributors of people from all around the world saying, hey, there's parts of this that I can improve, and everyone comes in and improves it. And that's one of the beauties of Bar, is that none of us are in the video game industry as our day jobs. We are all just hardcore RTS fans wanting to build and having the opportunity to build the best RTS that we can think of.
Being able to directly speak with the Chris Taylor and his energetic and passionate way of working on that and talking about that and complimenting us on Bar, that was goosebumps all over, and it was a really great talk. I think I can speak for many people inside the team, that this was like a dream come true.
It was really amazing to hear from basically one of our idols to that the direction that we're going in. He thinks that that's a great direction to be in, and his energy is absolutely amazing, and it really does stick with you. And just the enthusiasm and passion that he has for his projects really do give us a lot of motivation and help. And all of the compliments and the reinforcement that we received from Chris have been absolutely invaluable. So, well, where is Bar headed? Well, we're talking about, well, beyond all reasons. So we're absolutely headed for Steam. That's part of one of our main goals. We want to give the world the RTS game that hasn't been released yet. That's amazing in all aspects. And one of the number one questions we receive from the community of is it even on Steam, and why isn't it on Steam? And we feel that there's quite a few big developments left that we still need to tackle in order to be able to go to Steam, because we want to offer the best possible experience, especially to new players, which is very important, because we feel that a lot of our core gameplay revolves around large team games, and we want to provide the tutorials and the basic groundwork for a player to be easily able to transition from trying out maybe a few single player games or playing the tutorial and then being able to have fun in a large team game. And that's a very, very big thing. Also, we all need to do quite a bit of work on the infrastructure side, because, well, we want to be able to keep everyone playing the game when we're on Steam and not fall over from the influx. And what we really want to utilize on the Steam side is the Steam Workshop, so that we can migrate all of our custom widgets and modding things there, and hopefully that will further spur the community to take the game in directions that we didn't even think of yet. I don't see Bar ending in the sense that, okay, well, we put it on Steam and then we go take a nap for a year, even though we might need it at that point. I've already been in this for more than a decade, and there's the entire team is still as enthusiastic as pretty much the day they joined. We're already pretty happy with our current alpha state, but we don't feel that this is in any way even Steam early access ready. We would definitely want, since we have the feeling that you only really get one good shot at going on Steam with the initial publicity there, and maybe going on the front page, or maybe being picked up by other media outlets and being covered, that experience of new players has to be spot on, because it's very hard to tell someone, a year later of they tried a game, they maybe didn't like it, and then tell them a year later, oh, it's much better now. The likelihood of someone coming back and trying a game that they already bounced off of once is quite low. I can just say from that personal experience on that.
And really, when considering the fact that Beyond All Reason is essentially the Total Annihilation sequel fans have always dreamed of, created by the fans, this game is the perfect representation of how much the RTS community still to this day cares about a 90s game in which you blow up a bunch of robots. Take a look at any of the comment sections on any Total Annihilation videos, and you'll be constantly met with nostalgic posts from people reminiscing about the good old days of 90s gaming. Fans associating TA with their first PC, which was likely an aged relic of the time, I know mine was, and yet it was also perfect for a few hours of mindless explosions. Or posts where people remember friends and family members who helped introduce them to the game. For me personally, I think of Total Annihilation, and I remember childhood moments watching my father play it, remembering how intoxicating the visuals were, or browsing the manual over and over, the fabled Commander's Handbook by his side, in the hope that I'd get to have a go, and then the massive exhilaration when the day finally came and I was given the chance to play a few rounds. After that, I was soon begging my parents for a PC of my own, so that I didn't have to keep stealing theirs in order to play it. That beautiful off-white brick of a PC with which I could play Solitaire, Pinball, and Total Annihilation. And it was goddamn glorious. But my memory isn't unique, it's similar to thousands, hundreds of thousands. If you see an RTS game likened to Total Annihilation, the community instantly takes an interest. Over 25 years later, people are still modding this game, still bug fixing the newer Steam or GOG releases, still listening to its soundtrack, and they still want more. but unless you're happy with a spiritual successor or fan project, more is something that we're unlikely to ever receive. And that's okay. There's a reason certain properties are perhaps left best in the perfect form we remember them to be. Let's be honest, if a sequel came out tomorrow, unless it was astronomically good, I don't think it would live up to the expectations of a fanbase that harbors so much adoration for the original. I'm okay with there never being another Total Annihilation, because the original was exactly what it needed to be. Sure, there's still a market out there for your Planetary Annihilation, Supreme Commanders, 0K, and beyond all reason. We may never get a Total Annihilation 2, but we'll certainly get games influenced by it. Chris Taylor and the team's legacy is one that has inspired an entire era of new developers who want to see an RTS be just as thrilling as Total Annihilation, with some of them resolving to just make it themselves. And even if the name isn't pasted on the box art, that can be just as exciting.
The fact that we still talk about Total Annihilation today, to the degree that we do, is pretty damn impressive. It shows how much of an impact this game had on so many people, from its creators, to the players, to people who never played it at all, but inadvertently got into one of its successors, like Supreme Commander or Bar. At the time of this video's release, April 2024, Total Annihilation is nearing its 30-year anniversary. In fact, it's been about that long now since Chris Taylor and the wider team started working on the game back at Cavedog. Blissfully unaware of the impact that their, as they initially called it, really cool wargame would have on the wider strategy genre and the next decades of RTS development. And it was a significant impact. Even looking past direct successors, games like Supreme Commander, mechanics and systems from Total Annihilation have found their way into basically every successful strategy game you've ever played. True line of sight, 3D terrain, even ballistics to some extent. These are all things that have to some degree become staples in real-time strategy. Total Annihilation is a fantastic game, yes, both at the time of its release and still to this day. But I think the biggest thing it gave to strategy wasn't even the game itself, but it was the influence it had on the genre, and the life that flourished in the months, years, and decades since its release.
The whole thing about having two games, TA and Supreme Commander, have active communities and folks creating really true to feature form, whatever, real, they didn't go off and mutate it much. They've really held to a lot of the core design principles. I mean, the subtleties are all there. Is amazing. You guys will think I'm crazy for saying this, but there are days, and you are, so ready for this? I think some days I'm living in the Matrix. And I'm just, I'm just like, I'm just living my fantasy here. That stuff that I've designed is still appreciated, played, enjoyed in some form or another 25, 30 years later. I mean, how many designers who design games, and there is brilliant designers out there that have nothing like this phenomena happening. I mean, this is like lightning striking you twice, and you're lucky to get it to strike you once. Well, the positive light, the good lightning, where you have a cigarette and it lights your cigarette for you, out there in the middle of Kansas.
Thank you all so much for watching. This video was an absolute mission, and I couldn't have done it without my partner in crime, Bad Ghosts. We've been concepting this video for basically 2 years at this point, and we've been properly working on it for pretty much all of this year, so it feels amazing to have it done and out for you guys to all enjoy. It was his idea to do this as one big video that just released on my channel, so it would mean the world to me if you would go over and check him out. It's a massive thing for a creator to put in all this work and not even release a video on their channel, so massive respect for him for doing that to ensure that this video could be the best it could be. There are links to his channel in the description, so please go check him out. Also, huge thanks to Chris Taylor for talking to us both, and to Beerith and Icequick from the Beyond All Reason team for giving their unique perspective. And lastly, thank you for watching, and thanks to my and Bad Ghost patrons who support us. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting him or I, as it helps us out massively. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.
What would have happened if I had stayed? What would there have been for a TA2? I think TA2 would have looked a lot like Supreme Commander 1. The franchise, the fact that no one's ever made a TA2. Here we are, all these years later, no TA2. I think whoever's going to do TA2 has to have balls, like gigantic balls of steel. Can I say that? Can I say that? Like bowling balls of steel? Because if they F that up, they have waited the longest time to F up something that people are like deeply anticipating. And honestly, I throw a challenge to them. I dare you to design a game that can live up to the I dare. You know who really has done it? And these guys do have balls of steel, and they've delivered, is the Beyond All Reason gang. Those guys have delivered something that is so much closer to Total Annihilation 2 than I think anyone will ever achieve. So I think if you, but you understand, they did it in a different context. They did it with a different sort of set of parameters around it, and they've achieved something really, really impressive. I was on a game, 32v32, like what? And it played, the engine stood up, and the battles were amazing and epic. If you haven't seen that game, it is, I was mesmerized from beginning to end of what they did. So I think maybe I would be so lucky if I could create something as impressive as what they did, especially with the constraints that I'm sure they have as well. So big, I'm such a fan. And I've got my hat. Hey, holy, before we completely run out of time, I got my Beyond, I got my bar hat. But when I walk around Costco, they're like, oh, he's just, he must be looking forward to his next drink. But I'm like, no, this is Beyond All Reason. So, yeah.